happens in our brains when we get frightened? Why do some people develop what's called post-traumatic stress disorder? And can you erase unwanted memories? Well, to talk about recent breakthroughs in research into fear and post-traumatic stress disorder, joining us for our weekly science slot is Luke O'Neill, Professor of Biochemistry and Director of the Trinity Biomedical Sciences Institute at Tcsd. Luke, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, we all go through traumas, but Ptsd, post-traumatic stress disorder, who gets that and who doesn't?
Yeah, it's a horrible, horrible illness, Pat, by the way. You know, it's quite common too. Like in the US Army, 20% of soldiers get post-traumatic stress after some horrific incident, say in the battlefield or whatever it might be. And what it is you just can't forget a horrible incident, and it keeps coming back to you the whole time. You can't sleep. You know, they often become, heavy drinkers, drug users, and of course at the end of it, it's suicide. So it's extremely serious as a condition.
Do they relive the experience? Is that what it is, or is it a memory? You know, we can all throw our minds back to something that was unpleasant. Yeah, I can remember that particular happening. But do they actually just do that, or do they go through it all over again?
Yeah, they keep reliving the experience. They've nightmares. They wake in the morning. It's the first thing you think of. And it affects your day-to-day life very, very seriously. So whatever's happened there, the memory of that event has got hardwired into your brain, and those memories keep coming, especially with triggers. So a loud bang, say, or something, they'll go into a sudden state of shock, for instance. We'll reawaken these horrific memories.
So if you're in combat, for example, and you've seen some terrible things, you hear a loud bang and suddenly you're crouching behind the nearest dustbin with an air pistol in your hand about to shoot somebody, but you can't.
Yeah, and the thing is, they have what's called hypervigilance is the key feature. They're always on edge and they're waiting for something horrible to happen, and that's because when they're in the battlefield, they're hypervigilant because the enemy's about to shoot at them, whatever it might be, and that stays with them. Then when they're back in,
so they can't reprogram.
They can't reprogram their brains and escape this. Yeah, and 20%. There are 7.7 million Americans, Pat, with post-traumatic stress disorder, they reckon at the moment, which is incredible. Another horrible fact is the Canadian Army is very worried because they were in Afghanistan, and they've all gone back to Canada now, and again about 20% have this, right? And really worryingly, the number of suicides in ex-soldiers is about to exceed the number killed in combat. Isn't that horrendous? So this is how serious it might be. So the armies all over the world are now investigating this and trying to come up with ways to treat it.
So the armies are funding the research?
They are hugely, and that's where the breakthroughs are happening. Because if you have 7.7 million veterans with depression, alcoholism, all it's costing the army a huge amount of money, to cover their health costs and so on. So there's a huge need now to come up with better ways to treat it.
And there are societal effects, of course. Besides the loss and bereavement caused by suicide, there are presumably people who turn to drink, drugs, become dysfunctional in other ways, turn to crime, and all of these things. Yeah. Have a terrible
the
toll.
First one is family breakdown, and people get divorced more readily. They run away from their families. They neglect their children. That's the immediate effect of post-traumatic stress in the US Army, for instance. And again, that has a big cost on society as well. That marital breakdown and family breakdown would have that effect.
All right. Now, have they discovered whether some people just don't get it, don't suffer from it, no matter how awful an experience they've had in combat?
What's very interesting is who gets it and who doesn't, because you could have 100 soldiers, or in you and I or whatever in the street, in a traffic accident or something like that. Some people just get a horrific event happens to them, and they suffer obviously, and they get very anxious and they're fearful for a while, but eventually it dampens down and they learn to live with it, or perhaps the memory fades a bit. But in this 20% of people, it just stays with them, and the big mystery there is, why do some people go into post-traumatic stress, which is 20%, and the 80% don't?
If you consider, say, Formula One drivers, and both of them two people have catastrophic injuries and they get back behind the wheel, and one just can't do it anymore, and the other is gung-ho.
Exactly. They've looked at this because, of course, it'll be good to screen these people out, by the way, in the army, and don't send some people into combat because they've got a higher risk of developing post-traumatic stress. And there's a list of things what makes people at risk of it. A traumatised childhood is the usual kind of thing, Broken families, often they become soldiers, they're at a higher risk of developing it. There's something in your background and the way your brain is wired, maybe during adolescence, say, that might predispose you to this kind of thing. I'm trying to figure out what this might be.
I wonder to what extent realists are less likely. You go out, you know what you're going to expect. I mean, for example, a firefighter who is trained to go into burning buildings and haul out charred corpses, for example, it's still awful for them, but they're trained to do it.
They are. There's two things to think about. If your life's at risk, first of all, that has a big effect on this. If you're frightened the whole time you're going to die, that'll promote it, right? But if you're not in a life-threatening situation and yet you're seeing trauma, that can affect people badly as well. And of course, training is very interesting. So that if you train people to anticipate this, there's a much lower incidence of it. And the Canadians, again, Army at the forefront, they're inventing video games, and you plug on a helmet and they put you into a combat zone, and you aren't in danger of being killed, but you see horrible things happening, but it's not real, obviously. That lowers the risk of it when you're in the battlefield. So they're trying to come up with new ways to train people to prepare them to see these awful things.
Yeah. So this is just literally assimilating them to battle conditions, and then when it's real, there are of course dangers to that, because we know that we don't want kids to think the video games they're playing they can replicate that kind of behaviour in real life.
That's true, yeah. But these are amazing. It's almost like you're in a battle situation. You see somebody getting blown up in front of you. You can now recreate that, using computer technologies, and prepare you for that should it happen. And it seems to help a little bit.
It helps a little bit. Presumably, shell shock in World War I was PTSD.
Yeah, that was the first time it was described clinically. So doctors begin to notice that soldiers coming back from the front had certain behaviours. They couldn't sleep, obviously, and they were panicking, and they'd go into a sudden shock state if a bang went off, and they called it shell shock initially. And of course now we know that that's actually this post-traumatic stress. And what's interesting is, Pat, those soldiers were in the worst possible situation. They were conscripts. Your first instinct is to run like crazy if someone's shooting at you, but duty made them stay because they were part of the army, and they feel it'd be cowardice to run away. And that conflict between duty and a natural response to run was what set up this tension in their brains, they reckon, that then would promote post-traumatic stress. And that was the first time it was described.
And of course people were shot in the trenches by their own side because they were deemed cowards.
They were, and it was shameful to run, obviously. Even though every instinct is saying get the hell out of here, you won't run because you feel you've got a responsibility to your comrades, and you'd be called a coward. And that tension seems to set up the wiring in the brain such that when there was trauma, it would be laid down as post-traumatic stress.
A question about the symptoms. You've mentioned some of them, reliving the terrors at night and so on. Can you ask your guest Luke if he thinks PTSD and chronic fatigue syndrome are linked?
Yeah, there's evidence for that indeed. Now, because sleep is a huge issue here, because you're not going to get a good night's sleep, and even when you fall asleep, remember we discussed in a previous show about REM sleep. That doesn't really happen when you're stressed in this way. So even though you get some sleep, you wake up exhausted, and that will promote fatigue anyway and give rise to chronic fatigue, and that could well be a part of chronic fatigue syndrome, in fact.
And of course that in turn, if you're not getting your REM sleep and you've got chronic fatigue, it can lead to the body succumbing to other conditions.
Exactly, that's exactly it. Yeah, so there's a link there.
A WAG has been on. I wonder how many Manchester United supporters are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as Moyes disease.
Oh, very good. Yes, that's right, exactly. Yeah.
The soldier lover in Ryan's daughter seems to have had PTSD.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, that's a very good example of it, Tavil. And he eventually commits suicide, I think, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Because he's so stressed by the whole thing. And that, again, would be a classic example. And in the 1920s, you see the first really careful documenting of people suffering from this. And remember, shell shock was almost seen like cowardice in a strange way in the First World War as well. But eventually doctors said, no, there's something very serious happening here that needs to be looked at clinically.
Now, someone else wants to know, can the same trauma from a social event, for example, have the same effect?
It can. I mean, remember, forget the army for a minute. If you're attacked in the street, and of course a really interesting one is rape victims, relive it the whole time over and over again. So any traumatic event that really disturbs you could get laid down in your brain and drive a post-traumatic event, and you can't get over it, you can't escape from it. And any situation that's traumatic could trigger it.
Okay, now let's move on to the science, because they're trying to figure out what's going on in the brain. So who's doing the work and what have they discovered?
Yeah, but again, we don't like the army, especially for doing research, because often you think they're making new bombs and biological weapons. But they're investing heavily in psychology. They've got legions of researchers studying this kind of thing. So they fund a lot of it. Many universities around, and including in Trinity, there's people interested in this as a psychological process. It's not psychiatric, remember, in a way, because it's a normal brain that's going into a sort of a dysfunctional state. So lots of researchers in Columbia University leading the way. They've discovered the neurons in the brain that seem to be activated in people who eventually turn into having post-traumatic stress. And the type of neurons, they're called interneurons, and they've been mapped very carefully. They've been a part of the brain called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is where you lay down memories anyway. Yeah. And someone who is at risk of this PTSD type thing, certain parts of the hippocampus light up much more readily, say. And that gives you the first clue as to something physical happening here in that part of the brain. And then again, sadly in mice, we always talk about mice as the model, you can limit these neurons now and prevent these fearful memories from being being laid down. That was published about 2 months ago.
How do you mean you limit the neurons?
There's clever ways to take out certain neuronal pathways in the hippocampus. Clever technology can be used to sort of turn off those neurons in that part of the brain.
Does it mean like opening them up and going in with a little probe and doing that?
Exactly. You can stimulate them electrically and then desensitize them is what they do. And then put mice through an experiment that gives them terrible trauma, because you can frighten mice as well. As a friend of mine said this morning, I was talking about, do you take his cheese away? Is that how a mouse gets traumatized? I'm not quite sure how they induce post-traumatic stress in a mouse, but you can certainly drive it in mice, and then you can get rid of these neurons, and then they don't suffer from it. So that was the first sort of real physical evidence that certain parts of the brain are overactive and will give rise to a post-traumatic state.
Now, is there a pill that you can take, maybe shortly after the traumatic event, that will limit the development of PTSD?
That's easily the most exciting thing, and that's what got me into this, I guess, in the first place. About 3 months ago, the US Army started to publish some of this research, and there is a pill you can take within 30 minutes of the trauma, they reckon, and it'll stop this post-traumatic stress event happening. And what that pill seems to do is stops these memories getting laid down in that part of the brain such that you keep reliving it. Now, if this is true, Pat, that means every combat soldier will have a pill in his pocket, and if he's exposed to a horrific trauma, as long as he takes that pill within 30 minutes of the trauma happening, he will not go into post-traumatic stress if he's at risk of that. Now, he'll still get a bit frightened, he'll be
will he remember
fearful.
The thing that happened?
It's almost like you're wiping the slate clean in a way. So what we think is happening is the DNA, interestingly, seems to change in the brain when you've had a horrific traumatic event. It gets marked differently, and those marks then keep expressing themselves with memory down the line, I guess. This drug is able to wipe those marks clean, and therefore stops this re-emerging, I guess. When a bang goes off in a shopping mall or something, you won't go into this horrific fear response. Now, again, it's very experimental. Let's not make any bones about it. It's still very early days. They've done lots of stuff on animal models of this, and they're giving it to humans now just to look at safety initially. But the signs this might work.
Yeah, but this is immediately thereafter.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone comes to the doctor and says, this happened to me 5 years ago and I've been tormented by it ever since, can you give me something, doc, that'll wipe that memory away?
Well, the current therapy is called Extinction Therapy in a way, and it's interesting this works up to a point. So you get the person to relive it in a safe environment, right? And that seems to work a bit in some cases. So again, in the case of the army, they'll relive the incident that gave rise to the trauma, and that can desensitize their brains over time. It's a bit like having a phobia, I suppose, and you keep getting exposed to it. And there's some evidence that works in about 30% of cases, right? So there's already ways to do this. Now, again, there's a time limit on this, you're right. So in other words, within about 3 or 4 months of it is key. If it goes beyond that, it's almost like
embedded.
it's hardwired. Yeah, and you'll never be able to reverse that, really. And you might get slightly better as you go along, but it's much more difficult.
And have they done the extinction thing with mice?
They have, absolutely, yeah. And again, 1 to 2 hours is the time limit there in a mouse. If you can expose them to the threat in a safe environment, the mice can then begin to get over it, I suppose. So there seems to be something about the way memories are being laid down. Yeah. And of course, what's interesting is that this is all about how memory works, Pat. And we still don't know the basis for memory in the brain, like why you remember certain things. It must be neurons firing in various ways, So it really speaks to the memory process itself as well, I guess.
Now, you mentioned that the DNA gets altered. Does that mean that you pass the trauma down the generations?
Well, this is the strange thing. Now, when we talk about the DNA being altered, the actual genes don't change. They're hardwired into your brain. There's marks on the genes get changed, which ramps them up or ramps them down. So it's a bit complicated. Now, whether it gets passed into the next generation is a really good question, and there's some evidence for that, terrifyingly, that if you expose a mouse to trauma, say a loud noise or electric shock or something, there's some evidence that the offspring will also be hypersensitive to that loud noise. Now, if that's true, that means pregnant mothers have something else to worry about, basically, because
besides
if they experience
smoking and drinking and chocolate or whatever else they might be worrying their heads about.
Exactly.
Now something else.
And there's a bit of evidence for that it can transmit to the next generation, these marks. That's a slightly earlier stage of research, but certainly in humans who undergo these traumatic events, they're finding evidence that the DNA in the brain gets modified, and that's part of the mechanism.
Another one, that pill will surely severely hamper military investigations if people forget these events. That's from Kieran and Skerries.
Well, there's a worry. This is a natural response where you're supposed to be traumatised by horrific things, and it's happening to stop you going into that situation. Again, this is part of the problem in a sense. I mean, the reason why our brains are wired in this way is don't go near that fire and put your hand in it because you had a traumatic event last time, and that's the normal response, I suppose. We're talking about the extreme case where that normal response becomes pathologic, I suppose. And remember, it's not normal memories. I mean, your normal memory's okay with this new pill, apparently. It's just a huge traumatic memory that seems to be getting affected by the pill. So that would make it more useful.
Another question, do people with severe PTSD tend to relapse?
They do, indeed. It's a lifelong illness, Pat, and this is the trouble with this. Once it's embedded, it can go on for years and years and years. And of course, a really good example is, as I say, rape victims, horrible, or child abuse victims. What's happening in those people is they're having a hugely traumatic event, which they keep reliving in various ways for the rest of their lives. And that's I guess, in civilian life, that's the much more serious thing. So again, if you could use a way to help those people post-trauma, such that that post-traumatic event doesn't get relived, that'd be a big addition to it.
I wonder if there's any evidence about the half full glass and the half empty glass kind of personality. You know, that I've talked to people who've been severely traumatized by abuse in their lives, in their early lives, and then I've talked to other people who said, you know, I was never going to get that, so and so get me down. I just got on with it. Now, it doesn't mean I don't want retribution, I don't want vindication, all of that, but I just got on with my life and I lived it the way I wanted. And then someone in a parallel situation cannot do that.
Yeah. Personality comes into it, Pat, there's no question, and the types of personality is a big interest of psychologists. Some people are more robust in their personalities and can handle things, but again, that seems to be based on your childhood and your experiences early in life. And they all talk about these stressful life events, Pat, so eventually we all will be severely stressed by something and go into post-traumatic stress if we just, in other words, I think we can all cope with 7 major life stressful events, and then eventually we'd all break down, basically. So some people are at different stages on that road, perhaps, you know, and maybe they're more able to deal with it.
Someone else asks, are there more prosaic causes for this, in, you know, not necessarily military things or catastrophic car accidents, such as marriage breakdown, the loss of children? I think of these things all the time.
Absolutely. If you look at the top 10 stressors, Pat, in people's lives, it's things like marital breakdown, for instance. Losing your job is a huge one that people have. You know, they always say number one is, you know, if you're trying to sell your house is even traumatic, for instance. All these things add to the mix, really, you know. And again, some people will find those extra stressful and then begin to go down this road, I guess.
And a final question, technical one for a scientist like yourself. How does this pill that they're developing, pass the blood-brain barrier?
Very good question, that. Yes, certain drugs can pass the blood-brain barrier, and these are called HDAC inhibitors for that listener if they want to look them up. And these drugs are being used in different contexts anyway, and they're able to cross the blood-brain barrier. That's the key thing, because obviously if they couldn't, you'd worry it is some kind of snake oil, I suppose. But these get into the brain and begin to wipe these marks off the DNA is the idea.
All right, we'll leave it there for today. Luke O'Neill, Professor of Biochemistry and Director of the Trinity Biomedical Sciences Institute at Trinity College. Thank you very much for joining us.